Fifth argument, Daniel's distinction. Do you understand what we're doing? I'm giving you the arguments. That, not all of them, but I'm giving you a whole bunch of arguments that prove that the glorious land of verse 41 is not the Seventh-day Adventist church. It's the United States of America. Daniel's distinction. Verse 40, if you're in Daniel 11, verse 41, it speaks of the glorious land. But what's it say in verse 45? And he, the king of the north, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Now, brothers and sisters, it's easy to show from the scriptures that the glorious holy mountain is God's church at the end of the world. Go to Isaiah 2, verses 2 and onward. Isaiah 2:2, and it shall come to pass in the last days. And then it identifies that the glorious holy mountain is God's church, his people at the end of the world. All the prophets agree. When Daniel, in verse 45 of Daniel 11, identifies the glorious holy mountain in Scripture is God's church at the end of the world, just before probation closes. If Daniel had wanted us to think that the glorious land in verse 41 was his church, he would have said glorious holy mountain. He did not say that. In verse 41, he said glorious land. Daniel is making a distinction. Is Daniel a careful author or is he a careless author? If he's a careless author, then maybe we're supposed to understand that the glorious land is really the glorious holy mountain. But if he's a careful writer, then we are to understand that he's making a distinction between land and holy mountain. Okay? And this distinction, it impacts all kinds of things in the book of Daniel. All kinds of things. Okay, those people that are wrong on the daily, they say that sir and room, that are both translated as take away, they say they both mean the same thing. But Daniel made a distinction between the two. They don't mean the same thing. Okay? Those people that are wrong on the daily in Adventism that teach that it's Christ's sanctuary ministry, they tell you that the sanctuary in Daniel 8:11 and Daniel 13 and Daniel 14, that it's the same sanctuary. Yet in verse 11, it's mikdash. And in verses 13 and 14, the Hebrew word that's translated as sanctuary is kodesh. Why would Daniel, in 4 verses, use 2 different Hebrew words that gets translated as sanctuary if he didn't want us to see a distinction? There's all kinds of places in the argument over this prophetic message in the book of Daniel where it boils down to, is Daniel a careless author or is he a careful author? And he's careful. When he says rum here and sir here, he's saying 2 different things. Where he says mikdash here, kodesh here, he's saying 2 different things. Where he says glorious land in verse 41 and glorious holy mountain in verse 45, the glorious holy mountain is the Seventh-day Adventism at the end of the world. It's God's church at the end of the world. That alone tells you that the glorious land cannot be God's church. If Daniel had wanted us to believe that, he would have said glorious holy mountain. You may not think that's an argument, but that argument's sound. Okay, another argument, pioneers. How many of you have read The Sanctuary in the 2300 Days by Andrews? Okay. How many know who Andrews is? All right. What did they name after Andrews? The primary seminary for the Adventist pastors, named after this man. And this article, The Sanctuary in the 2300 Days, you know why he wrote this article? He wrote it right after the disappointment in order to explain the Millerite mistake of why the Millerites believed the sanctuary was the earth. This has been the classic position of Adventism from 1845 onward on what the sanctuary is. Okay, this is a classic document in Adventist history. In reality, Adventists should know this paper. The Sanctuary in the 2300 Days is where God clarifies the mistake over the sanctuary being the earth. Even if you don't know it. Okay? And in this document, what Andrews does, and he doesn't use any spirit of prophecy, it's all Bible. He goes through and shows what the land of Israel is, what the sanctuary is, what the earth is, and what the church is. From the Bible, he goes through those 4 entities, and it's not a short paper, it's a long paper. And here's a paragraph where he's reaching his conclusion. We have found that the earth is not the sanctuary, but simply the territory where it will finally be located. That the church is not the sanctuary, but simply the worshipers connected with the sanctuary. And that the land of Canaan is not the sanctuary, but that it is the place where the typical sanctuary was located. Did you see what he's saying? He's very clear that the church and the land, two different entities. This is foundational truth in Adventism from the pioneer that we name our most famous seminary after, Andrews University. Of course, I've already mentioned Hiram Edson. You have that quote here, where he identifies that the glorious land of Daniel 11, verse 41 is the United States. Seventh argument. Are you following the arguments? You may not understand what the relevance of these arguments are, right? Perhaps. Brothers and sisters, you weren't here, all of you weren't here this whole week. But earlier this week, to try to bring you up a little bit to speed on this, earlier this week we discussed the fact that when Peter talks about the latter rain in Acts chapter 3, that he talks about the times of refreshing. Okay. The refreshing is the latter rain. And there's at least two, because he says times. What are the times of the latter rain? Spring and summer, early latter. So what do they represent? Well, let me ask you this. What's a lion represent? There's the best answer. It depends on the context. A lion could be Satan, it can be Christ, it can be Judah. Same with the early and latter rain. The early rain for the Christian church was Pentecost. The latter rain for the Christian church is at the end of the world. The early rain for Adventism was the midnight cry. The latter rain for Adventism is at the end of the world. But only those that have the early rain will receive the latter rain. So the early and latter rain are something in my personal experience too. It's not just the early and latter rain for the Christian church or the early or latter rain for Adventism. I have to have the early rain in my own experience before I'll receive the latter rain. And earlier this week, we pointed out what the latter rain is. What's the latter rain? It's a message. Okay. This is the rest and the refreshing, yet they would not hear. Okay. And Adventism is repeating the Millerite history here at the end. And the Millerite history is the history of two messages. The first angel's message, the second angel's message. We have two messages. What's the message? Well, what's a message? It's the latter rain in one sense. What's the first message? It's the early rain. The second message is the latter rain. The first message is the spring rain. The second message is the summer rain. It depends on the context. The early rain for us, brothers and sisters, in terms of the first and second angel's message, is the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. If you do not understand that message, if you do not have the ability to defend that message, then you haven't received the early rain, and you cannot be benefited by the latter rain. Okay? And what I'm telling you is based upon my experience. The place where people fall on their sword. The argument over the early rain message of Adventism. The argument over the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. Without a doubt, it is the glorious land. You need to understand the glorious land. So that's what we're doing here. Because if you don't have the early rain message, you cannot understand the latter rain message. Okay? Bottom of page 13, from the rise and fall of nations as made plain in the book of Daniel and Revelation, we need to learn how worthless is outward and worldly glory. Daniel and Revelation is the story of the rise and fall of nations. It is not the story of the rise and fall of churches. Okay, the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 is talking about the papacy conquering the Soviet Union, then conquering the United States, then conquering all the countries of the world. The rise and fall of nations as made plain in the book of Daniel. You will see another quote of similar nature in the next page. A long one. I'm going to pass over. Upward look, page 96, and then a one-liner from Bible Training School, December 1st, 1912. The prophet Daniel described the kingdoms that would rise and fall. Daniel 11, verse 41, the glorious land, it's a kingdom that falls. It's not a church. You follow me? Argument number 8, from the beginning of Daniel's last prophecy. You have the verses there, 11 verse 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9. If you're not familiar with those verses represent, break open God's Helping Hand, Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith, and you'll see that the whole prophetic history of Daniel 11 is talking about the conquering of nations, period. For us to believe that all through these verses we're seeing nations conquered by other nations, all the way up to verse 41, and then you get to verse 41 and suddenly it's not the conquering of the nation, it's a conquering of a church. It's just inconsistent with how the Lord speaks to us. He would have to take some verses in advance of verse 41 and teach us somehow, hey, I'm going to change gears here now. This whole vision's about nations that have been conquered, but now I'm going to switch and identify the Seventh-day Adventist church being conquered. It's out of the context of the vision itself, Daniel 11 visions. Ninth argument, 3 Romes. Very quickly. When pagan Rome took control of the world, according to Daniel 8:9, had to conquer 3 geographical areas. What are those 3 geographical areas? Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Israel, Palestine. Okay. When did it conquer the third of those 3 geographical areas? Conquered Egypt, the third, 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, one of the most famous maritime battles in ancient history. And then it ruled the world supremely for a time in fulfillment of Daniel 11:24 for 360 years until Constantine moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople. But before it could rule the world supremely, it had to conquer 3 geographical areas: Syria, Israel, Egypt. Then it ruled for 360 years. Rome is a triple application of prophecy. Pagan Rome, Papal Rome identify the characteristics of modern Rome. In order for Papal Rome to take control of the world, in Daniel chapter 7, 3 horns had to be plucked up: the Heruli, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals. What was the third that was plucked up? The Ostrogoths. When were they plucked up? 538. Once the third geographical area was overcome, Papal Rome ruled the world supremely for 1260 years. That's the same as pagan Rome. Pagan Rome has to conquer 3 geographical areas and it rules the world supremely for 360 years. Papal Rome has to conquer 3 geographical areas and it rules the world supremely for 1260 years. Upon the testimony of 2, a thing is established. Modern Rome, in the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, have to conquer the king of the south, verse 40, the glorious land, verse 41, and Egypt, verse 42. You tell me what the king of the south, the glorious land, and Egypt are. They have to be geographical areas. It's already been established with pagan Rome and Papal Rome. The Soviet Union, the United States, or the Seventh-day Adventist Church? No. Couldn't possibly be that. On the testimony of 2, a thing is established. The Soviet Union, 1989. The United States in the very near future. Then Egypt, representing all the countries of the world. They get brought together through the activity of Islam. Right? It's the east wind that brings the one world government, right? We know that. We know that because Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. It's the east wind that brings the one world government, right? Because Egypt symbolizes the world. When the king of the north conquers Egypt, in verse 42, he conquers the whole world. How's the whole world brought together? According to Seventh-day Adventists, when it's brought together, it's the threefold union of the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet. How does that happen? Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. How did Egypt bring the whole world together in the beginning of Egypt? Oh, it was in the time of Joseph, wasn't it? And Pharaoh had a dream, didn't he? And there was 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph was given the wisdom to bring all of Egypt into bondage to Pharaoh. What was it that brought the 7 years of famine? It was the east wind. Who's the east wind of Bible prophecy? Who's the children of the east? It's Islam, brothers and sisters. It's Islam that brings the threefold union together.